The best bits of Joy Drive. Theatre, film, TV and more. Suzy Wrong reviews it all on Joy Drive.
Good afternoon, Suzy Wrong.
Good afternoon, Warren.
How are you?
I have been thinking today about Paul Rubens, who died earlier today, better known as Pee Wee Herman. He died I think last night, and then as well as Sinead O'Connor, who died I think sometime last week. So these two characters mean a lot to me, apparently, because since the announcement of their death, I've been thinking about the memory of the things that they had done in the early 90s that got them cancelled. You know, obviously at that time we didn't use this word, but now you look back and oh yeah, they got cancelled for doing things that I thought were amazing, that I thought were things that I fully approve. You know, Paul Rubens was caught in a compromising position in a what's that called, an adult theatre, and then Sinead O'Connor, obviously she tore a photograph of the Pope on TV, both things which I heard and I was surprised, like I was young and I was surprised at the outrage that met with the actions in America, and it just kind of showed me how what kind of culture we lived in, you know, and so I'm remembering those two, I guess, trailblazers, and that links to our show today, which is about that time.
It is. It's called Last Call. It is on Binge. I've got I think we should give a bit of a warning, Suzy, because I found it quite a strong program, and we'll talk about it shortly once you've said about it. And I don't know if we should hold back on what we think about it. So tell us about the program, Last Call.
It was the year 1991 when Peter Anderson was found murdered after being seen for the last time at a gay bar in Manhattan. Over the next 2 years, 3 more gay men were met with the same fate. This 4-part docuseries, Last Call, When a Serial Killer Stalked Queer New York, available to stream on Binge, investigates a little-known serial murderer from within the gay community. Unlike more famous perpetrators like Jeffrey Dahmer and Randy Kraft, where tragedies had involved gay encounters that happened underground, these cases in Last Call seem to have taken place in full view of the community. These were people who were known to other gay men who had lived active social lives in the scene. And while our queer worlds were beginning to open up in the early 90s, law enforcement was still as homophobic as before. And in the documentary, we can see their inability to understand gay life and how that lack of empathy impaired their judgment as they tried to carry out investigations. Now, it is no secret that, like many of you, I'm a fan of the true crime genre. I don't really know why I enjoy them so much, even if they can be a bit formulaic. But on this occasion, I was surprised to find myself quite moved by Last Call. It features interviews not only with friends and family who have been left behind, but also with queer elders who have worked all these years for the betterment of community. Some of these testimonies were really meaningful and incredibly powerful. In the final minutes of the series, Last Call stops being just another crime doco, especially when it makes assertions about these crimes continuing to happen today, in particular to trans women all across the USA. In reference to the early 90s, though, I'm sure most of us in Australia have heard of the Bondi gay murders. Warren, was there anything similar happening in Melbourne? Do you recall the dangers involved in your social life as a gay man at that time?
It's interesting because I do. I remember going to a club here in Melbourne, and it would have been, I don't know, the late 80s, or I think it was the late 80s. I was probably 18 or something like that. And the club was in St Kilda, and it was called Mandate. And, those people of, I suppose, my age will know the club quite well. It was a great club. And I remember one night coming out of the club and just waiting on the corner at the traffic lights to cross the road, and this policeman pulled up in a car, and I got abused like I've never been abused, and it was by a member of the Victoria Police at the time, and I was so scared. Anyway, he let me go, and I managed to, my friend came out and we got in the car and he drove me home, and I was shaken up by it, and I did nothing wrong. I just walked out of a gay club, and I don't know what this guy was thinking, but I could detect this anger in his voice, this homophobic hatred. And I've never heard anything like it, and it scared the crap out of me. And I never went back to that club afterwards.
Do you remember what... Oh, really?
I never went back. I was too scared to go back. I really was. I mean, an 18-year-old, I was scared. I was still living at home with my parents.
So, what did the cop ask you?
I was, what are you doing? What are you doing out here on the street? Blah, 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 blah. And I just walked out. I literally had just walked out of the club. And it was terrible. And anyway, so nothing ever happened of it, thank goodness. But he absolutely scared me. And it just made me think, wow, they're so horrible. And then I remember friends of mine were harassed. They were outdoors at Beats at the time. And one friend of mine was entrapped.
Oh, right. Like someone was trying to hook up with him and then revealed that
pretending.
They were...
So
right.
I mean, things did happen, and hopefully things have changed. But I'm speaking for a time in the past, and that is something that I experienced. So yes, it did happen, and it's happening all around the world. And the thing about watching this series is, it starts off with they're talking about the rising tide of anti-gay violence. I'm using the word anti-gay because that's the term that was used back then in the 90s. And it was talking about, hate crimes are increasing in New York City. And it just, I don't know, I thought, we're kind of at that stage now, aren't we, where we're seeing an increase in hate crimes and violence and protests and all these sorts of things. And I got a bit of the chills and thinking, is this a bit of deja vu? Like, we can't just say this was back in the 90s. Like, I'm sure the police are different now, but in terms of the anti-sentiment that's rising, don't you think so?
Well, I do feel like it's taken on a different form, because I think at the moment there is so much focus on these religious groups or whatever, however they label themselves, and how they're trying to form kind of quite powerful groups. I mean, we don't really know the extent of the power. They always look like they're small numbers, but they have a really loud voice, and they seem to be targeting, things like drag, story time sort of thing. I feel like maybe the violence has taken on a different form, or were you thinking about something else?
But it's still violence, and it's still hatred, and it's still towards our community. And I don't know. I just hope we're not going down that path again. It's interesting because the police and what they were doing in this documentary series. We're talking about the New York Police Department, and we're talking about people in that department working and saying to other members of the force, if you come out, I'm going to accidentally shoot your head off and make it look like an accident. I mean, come on. Who's going to come out?
Yeah, there were a lot of horrible things on that. And there were all these sort of tangents in this series that provided really useful information. I think it was really informative, like it's a real documentary. I found it really informative. And I found it very moving. I think some of the feelings you kind of don't know how to place them, which is maybe why you're feeling so passionate and emotional about it, because a lot of it feels like it's, it had things that haven't concluded, they're ongoing things, even though it's been such a long time.
Exactly. We were treated as though we were second-class citizens, and it says that in the documentary. And, the way that they ignored crimes against gay people was just terrible. And I don't know, and you get through that. I actually I couldn't get past episode 2. I am going to watch the last 2 episodes because I just found it really upsetting. And there was I think a Roman Catholic family as well, and they were talking in it, and they're going, they were talking about the guy's great uncle who was murdered, and the family is saying, yeah, your great uncle was, and apologies for using this word, okay, and I hope I don't offend anyone, but your great uncle was a faggot, and that's why he ended up that way. Like, this is their family talking about another family member. It just did my head in. Yeah,
it's horrible to watch. I think it was very well made. I probably had more of an emotional barrier towards these things. I kind of don't let myself get too sort of caught up with it, because it is really intense. It is really dark stuff. The thing that's interesting about this case is that the perpetrator, so the enemies, is from within our ranks, and maybe that's why we've never heard very much about this case, because he was a gay man and not completely out, like, most people were never completely out at that time, but he had lots of friends within the gay community. He had a lot of friends who were not gay, who knew that he was gay, but he had this, this really, really, really dark side. And I'm not, I think serial murderers are serial murderers. It has nothing to do with how a person is brought up. I feel like from all the information that I know, there's something, it's like such a serious mental condition. Like it's really hard to pin down any reason, any kind of conditioning that someone might have experienced. But it did make me think about the shame that we inherit, as queer people, who as children were always told that the things that we like, the things we aspired to be were wrong, and that we needed to move away from those things, or just we needed to block those things away from our minds. And I think it manifests in a really dark ways as we've grown into adults. And I feel like as a grown-up now, as a slightly older grown-up, I'm still working on these things that people were trying to teach me, the values that people were trying to impart on me, and the kind of shame that I kind of sometimes am not aware that I'm carrying in me, and how it manifests in the choices I make and the things I do.
And I think this is why I get so passionate and upset at these sort of things, Suzy, is because, like, when you're watching parents saying, "Don't come home, I'd rather you have cancer than be gay." I mean, these things are triggering to us. We're so traumatised all over the world, and this is what people are saying. This is what people are saying to their kids, for goodness sakes. Imagine the damage that does, sending that message to a kid who is just being themselves. And, I watch these documentaries and I get upset, and I feel like we have to get upset at this stuff because it still goes on.
It does still go on. Hopefully not to this extent. I do think that it is important to remind yourself that the world has changed, and that the young people, young people are experiencing now, are not the same as these, as these stories that we are reminded of from these documentaries. And certainly, I certainly wish that they're not experiencing the same challenges that we did back in the day. And I'm fairly certain things are different. Or at least, even if they do have problems like that at home, the amount of support that they can access is so much greater. Because this documentary reminded me of how hard it was to come out. There was talk about the feeling you get from going to a gay club or queer space for the first time, and how exciting it was. And it, because it was such a taboo, it took so much for me to go to my first queer space. I was so terrified of what it meant. And then it took me years to take that first step to my first gay bar in Sydney. And then when you get in there, just the normalcy of it just makes you think, wow, it took you 3 years to take this first step, or whatever that's happening in a person's mind. And hopefully things are much different now.
Well, I hope so too. I think, I think if we look at, and it talks a bit about this, HIV came along, and, I don't like saying the word silver lining. There's no silver lining. HIV was horrible, and so we lost so many people, and it was just a terrible, terrible epidemic that happened. But one thing that did come out of it was that it galvanised us. And it brought us all together, and rather than being so passive about things and just sitting back and saying, oh, the police don't care, they don't want to do anything about it, it was our community saying enough is enough, and we had ACT UP form out of it. And it showed us the power that we all have as a community, and we must never forget that we've got that.
Yeah, and in the show, you can see how the community was beginning to form, because it was, quite a few years since AIDS had become big news, right? Because it's 91, sort of 92. So the groups were sort of more galvanized, sort of more organized. But it's really good to see how the authorities were just not with the program. They really had to be beaten into shape.
Oh, so out of touch. And, and I heard something that I haven't heard before, and I think it was some religious woman that had become popular.
Oh, yes.
And she says, I hadn't heard this before. And I thought, oh my God, she really is an idiot, an absolute idiot. Homosexuals can't reproduce biologically, so they have to reproduce by
they have to
recruiting our children.
Yeah.
I mean, FFS. You know what that acronym means, don't you?
But I think at that time it was like considered normal knowledge, because
they brain like reproduce. Come on,
yeah,
you're the ones that are having the children, and we come out of you. Hello, wake up.
They never accepted us as natural. They always try to explain us away as being ungodly. That was always that thing. They refused to accept that God made us in His image the way that
For those who believe in God.
Yeah, God made everyone in their image, so that they were intent on sort of imposing an alternative narrative on us, so that somehow their religion still makes sense to us. But you know
what? If any kids are listening and they're copying that sort of information or what have you, and let's hope that no one is. It's all crap. There's nothing wrong with you. Full stop. Nothing wrong with you.
They have TikTok now.
They got TikTok. Everything's
They have TikTok. They have got all the information out there that we didn't have. That I, when I was living in Singapore, had to get through really like serious illegal means to access.
That would have been hard.
So the world is different. Yeah.
What was it like in Singapore in terms of police?
It was. You felt like you were living in a big church, like that. They were sort of quite pluralistic religiously, but they were, it just felt like a really traditional, puritanical, old-fashioned sort of place. So that was all really, really tough, and certainly much tougher than Australia was in the 80s and 90s, which is, it was one of the main reasons why I left that country to move here at that time. It was too much to bear.
Suzy, it is so good. I love our chats. I really enjoyed them, and I think it's good that we get passionate about things.
Good. I think passion is so important, especially for men like yourself. I think I think that that's so healthy. Like Australian men are not really good with their emotions in general, so don't be afraid of these things.
Oh, I'm not afraid, Suzy. Don't worry. It is called Last Call. It is streaming on Binge. Have a look at it. There's some strong stuff in there. Suzy, we have homework for next week. What are we watching?
It's finally come to Disney Plus Australia. Drag Me to Dinner, a comedy competition show involving drag queens trying to outdo each other at throwing parties and pulling out all the stops to entertain the judges. We did bring this up a few weeks ago. Was it a couple of months ago when I thought it was coming to Australia, but it didn't arrive. But we're getting to Drag Me to Dinner next week. It's a good thing because we need to shine the spotlight on our drag artists.
Fantastic, Suzy.
Thank you, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
See you, Suzy. That's Suzy Wrong.
Joy Drive on Joy 94.9 FM in Melbourne, Joy on your digital radio, iHeartRadio, TuneIn.com or the Joy app. No matter where you are.